Okay, so I want to talk for a second about unions, especially in the 19th century. There's been a lot of heated back and forth about unions and whether they're good or not, and although having been in a union, I tend to think that they are, on the whole, a good thing, I'd rather talk about why they were necessary in the first place. To be absolutely clear, we have labor unions mainly because working conditions in the industrial age were terrible. Workers in factories in industrialized nations like Britain and the U.S. had to work incredibly long hours under often dangerous conditions for pay that was generally low and could be slashed arbitrarily by employers. This made them angry, but as individuals, there wasn't a lot they could do about it. The relationship between workers and employers was adversarial. Workers wanted the best pay and conditions possible, and employers wanted to pay their workers as little as they could and make them work as long as they could under conditions that didn't require the employer spend a lot of money. In addition to better conditions, workers wanted greater security, i.e., they didn't want to be fired arbitrarily for something like making a joke about the boss's wife, or speaking out in favor of a political candidate, or asking for a raise. One of the biggest complaints about unions is that they restrict the freedom of union members to bargain for better wages and conditions individually. Unions bargain collectively, which means that the contract they negotiate is the same for all workers. One complaint is that less competent or effective workers get paid the same as more competent ones, so there is no incentive for them to get better. The flip side of this is that more effective workers can't get compensated for doing a better job. The collectively bargained contract limits their freedom to bargain for more. This argument underlies the idea of freedom of contract, that it is a worker's and an employer's right to reach a fair bargain without being constrained by another entity, in this case a union. But let's look at both sides of the argument from people at the time. After the Pullman strike of 1894, President Cleveland created the U.S. Strike Commission to investigate what had happened. Here is some of the testimony from Thomas W. Wicks, vice president of the Pullman Palace Car Company, and John D. Kernan, who was an investigator on the commission. Kernan: then you think that you have a right to refuse to recognize a union of the men designed for the purpose of presenting, through the ablest of their members, to your company the grievances which all complain of, or which any complain of? Wicks: that is the policy of the company, yes, sir. If we were to receive these men as representatives of the unions, they could probably force us to pay any wages which they saw fit and get the Pullman Company in the same shape that some of the railroads are by making concessions which ought not to be made. Kernan: don't you think that the opposite policy, to wit, that all your dealings with the men as individuals, in case you were one who sought to abuse your power, might enable you to pay the men, on the other hand, just what you saw fit? Wicks: well, of course, a man in an official position, if he is arbitrary and unfair, could work a great deal of injustice to the men, no doubt about that, but then it is a man's privilege to go to work somewhere else. The Supreme Court upheld this idea of freedom of contract in a number of cases, most notably Lochner versus New York. Courts ruled that unions violated people's freedom of contract for whatever was a fair price of their work. Courts also used this logic to strike down laws banning child labor, since it interfered with children's deep-seated desire to work in coal mines and factories, as well as employers' right to hire the cheapest and most exploitable labor force possible. And it was also used to strike down maximum hour laws because, courts ruled, it was unfair to prevent someone from working two back-to-back 12-hour shifts in a steel mill if he wanted to. And court used the idea to make it more difficult for unions to form and to prevent them from striking if they did form. If you're a real Supreme Court buff, you can take a look at Lowe versus Lawler, also known as the Danbury Hatters case, where the Supreme Court ruled that the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was definitely intended to apply to monopolistic pools and trusts, also applied to unions, which as a result were not allowed to require membership in order to work at a certain business, which is called the closed shop, or, in some cases, to strike. This is really important because the court's generally pro-business stance during the Lochner era meant that courts would strike down almost any government regulation that would make it more difficult or costly for a business to do what it wanted to do. Business was given a free hand to do what it wanted, which is why this period is sometimes referred to as the age of laissez-faire capitalism. But this also didn't mean that government was totally hands-off when it came to the economy. The government actually helped big business by raising tariffs. Some of you might be saying, wait, tariffs reduce trade, and that can't be good for business, which is true, in theory. The theory says that any artificial barrier to trade, which a tariff is, will reduce trade from its optimum level and thus be inefficient, and I guess this is true. But in historical reality, countries, especially when they're trying to build up nascent industries, put up tariffs all the time. And the United States in the 19th century was no exception. Okay, so back to unions. So the courts were against unions, and big business was against unions, but unions persisted because they were necessary to give workers a voice and to improve working conditions, which they did, at least for the workers lucky enough to get into a union. This leads to a whole other problem with unions, that they monopolize certain jobs, and this is a big problem, but I would argue not as big a problem as incredibly low wages, or lax worker safety, or brutally long hours, or absolutely no job security. And these are the problems that unions in the late 19th century tried to solve. Now I want to make one more point about unions and how we view them and what it says about how we study history. I would suggest that most people who have negative opinions of unions base those opinions on personal experiences with union workers, in which those workers were unpleasant or incompetent or some combination of the two. And I have no doubt that there are many unionized workers who fit that description. Based on this assumption, many will come to the conclusion that unions are inefficient and bad for the economy, or that they produce an unacceptable reduction of personal freedom. There are at least two problems with this view as far as I can see. The first is that it is not logical to assume that every unionized industry or endeavor is corrupt or incompetent. If this were the case, there just wouldn't be any such endeavors. They would all fail. The second is attributing the individual worker's unpleasantness or incompetence to the fact that he is in a union. I have probably had just as many unpleasant experiences with non-unionized workers as with those in unions. Statistically, this almost has to be the case because such a low percentage of workers are actually in unions. But if I said, man, I bet that service was so crappy because the waiter isn't in a union, you'd think I was off my rocker. It's incredibly easy to explain a phenomenon causally this way. To say that union membership causes incompetence because we think it takes away the negative incentive for being fired for incompetence. But we need to be careful when we impute causality this way, and when we generalize from our experience of the individual, this union worker is terrible, to stereotype the institution, unions are terrible. Some are, some aren't. And it's our job as students, historians, and citizens to try to make informed judgments about them. Thanks for watching.